Now we're going to dive into civil rights and liberties. We're going to go through the differences first because you may not know the differences. Now, College Board's not going to ask you what's the difference between civil rights and liberties, but for your own walking knowledge, you should know what the difference is. So, civil rights refer to the rights and freedoms that you have as a member of society. These are more social characteristics. So, they relate to how other people can treat you, how the government can treat you, how businesses can treat you. So think of, the United States Civil Rights Act of 1964. So people cannot discriminate against you on the basis of gender or on the basis of your skin color or any disabilities that you may have. These rights are typically written down in such laws as well as constitutions, and they're intended to protect individuals and groups of people from discrimination, inequality, and unfair treatment based on characteristics like race, gender, religion, or nationality. So you cannot segregate certain races throughout a restaurant or on a bus, for example. Civil liberties are fundamental rights that everyone has just for being a person that's typically protected from government infringements. So these are obviously written down in your constitutions and laws and international human rights instruments and are intended to safeguard individual autonomy, privacy, and personal freedom. So these are rights, just your right to live, your right to own property, your right to make decisions for yourself. Civil liberties also include freedoms such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, right to privacy, that sort of thing. Now let's talk about the protections of civil liberties. So let's go through our course countries a little bit. China has a constitution, if you don't remember that. They do have a constitution, and it states that the assembly and association, those freedoms, are protected rights. But the government strictly monitors civil society groups, as we've learned, and uses different tactics and restrictions and censorships against various groups of people that are perceived as a threat to the monopoly on power. Now, who has the monopoly on power? The Chinese Communist Party. China has been very restrictive to human rights groups that attempt to call out China on discrimination or not protecting civil liberties, and they criticize the conduct of the government. Leaders of these groups have been imprisoned and tortured. Russia's constitution cites protections as well for the freedom of assembly. It actually states here, this is quoted from the Constitution, citizens of the Russian Federation shall have the right to gather peacefully. So that's like for protesting. If they do so without weapons, so that's nonviolent. That's done for the security and stability of the country. Then they can hold meetings, rallies, demonstrations, marches, and pickets. It even gives examples of acts that they're allowed to do as per the Constitution. Russia does allow groups to protest policies, but since 2012, when they enacted a series of laws, it's been very hard for you to protest and speak out against the Russian government. It's criminalized the organization of protests that are not approved by the government. And essentially what this has done is that if the government doesn't approve of your cause, they're not going to approve of your protest. Russia allows citizens to form independent NGOs, which is a form of civil society, but another law passed in 2012 requires any groups that are politically involved and receive funding from foreign sources to register as foreign agents. And this is a big block to the creation of civil society groups and NGOs because they have to get some kind of funding a lot of the times to have a platform and to share their beliefs and to grow. So if they cannot get foreign funding as easily, they're not going to be able to exist as much. They're not going to be as diverse. They're not going to have as big of platforms. The finances of these groups are then able to be monitored more closely by government officials. So even if they get the money, the government's going to have a little more view over what happens with the money. And if anything goes wrong, they're going to arrest some people more quickly. They may even influence the funds or tax them at different rates. Iran's constitution cites protections as well for the freedom of assembly. It says public gatherings and marches may be freely held, provided arms are not carried, so they're non-violent, and that they're not detrimental to the fundamental principles of Islam. Remember, Iran's a theocracy. They want to uphold the principles of Sharia Islam. So they don't want any gatherings or protests or any other forms of civil society to impede on that. In 2014, their president publicly stated that some independent NGOs helped the government improve the provision of services. So the Iran's president says, okay, NGOs have had a little bit of a role, a little bit of influence. NGOs, remember, are civil society, so they have autonomy independent of the government, whether this be a formal or informal institution. But they're not run by the government themselves. And the goal of this is to influence policy, to influence government action and processes. And that's what the president says has happened in 2014. However, Iran's government has used various laws that they've enacted against domestic terrorism, which is good, and coercive tactics to restrict some independent groups. These restrictions of independent groups, your civil society groups, increased after the government used violence to suppress the election protests in 2009. And we've talked about these protests a lot this lecture. So you can probably tell that they had a pretty big scare on the Iranian government a little bit. Similar to China, human rights groups, including groups that advocate against Iran's use of the death penalty, which is still heavily used, have been restricted to great amounts thanks to these laws and manipulative tactics by the Iranian government. Now, I want to take a moment and discuss, what do these regimes fear the most? They fear being overthrown. The Iranian government fears that their supreme leader will be overthrown. The Chinese government believes that any civil society groups that speak out against them are a threat to their monopoly on power. The individuals in charge, the elitists, want to maintain their power and maintain their influence. And if there's any threat to them, they're going to take a lot of measures, even violent measures, to control that. Nigeria's legislator declined to pass legislation in 2018, so very recently, that would have required more government monitoring of the finances and approval of projects by some civil society groups and NGOs. So what this means is that the Nigerian legislator declined to restrict civil society more. The legislation was never passed because civil society groups and NGOs reached out and pressured the government to reject the legislation. When Amnesty International reported in 2018 that the government was inadequately protecting religious groups from Boko Haram attacks, that's a domestic Muslim terrorist group in central Nigeria, military leaders in Nigeria responded. They threatened to shut down the group's main office in Nigeria. So we can see here that civil society is kind of going both ways. They are promoting it by not restricting it, as seen by declining to pass this legislation. However, they threatened to shut down Amnesty International's main office for speaking out against the government. There have also been reports of Nigeria's security forces using excessive violence to shoot firearms into crowds, guns, to suppress protests, particularly related to human rights abuses against religious groups in Nigeria. So what does this all come down to? Nigeria is not a fully democratic regime, but it's not authoritarian. It is democratizing, and that's a big theme on this course, and that's what we see here. Both Mexico and the United Kingdom, which both have the highest historical prominence of civil society, regularly protect the rights of protest groups that protest peacefully. Just like in authoritarian regimes, security forces are used to keep public order. However, they're not used with as much force as in authoritarian regimes. Accusations of government using violence to suppress nonviolent demonstrators isn't as common in democratic regimes, of course, and it's more common that in democratic regimes, protesters who do accuse the government and government security forces of being violent and manipulating civil society are likely to get legal compensation for damages and injuries sustained by the government's actions. So that shows a great deal of difference between democratic and authoritarian regimes. And this is something that College Board may not expect you to initially remember on your AP exam. So if they throw this at you, you could go full force with this whole slide here. Let's look at community charge protests in the United Kingdom. So in 1990, the UK introduced the community charge, which is a poll tax. It replaced a previous system of local government rates. So yeah, more money. The poll tax was not treated well by the people. It was very unpopular, especially low-income households, because that means they have to give more money to the government. So yeah, and it imposed a flat rate on every adult. So no matter what your income was in the country, you paid the same amount. So the poor had to pay as much as the rich did. This led to widespread protests and riots, especially in London. And it include mass demonstrations and overall civil disobedience. Now, I included the word riot because it got pretty violent. It got pretty heavy in these protests. They weren't just people marching down the streets with signs and yelling through megaphones and stuff. So the largest protest occurred in London on March 31st, 1990, and about 200,000 people marched in opposition to the poll tax, which is a lot of people. And the pressure from these protests actually led to the repeal of the poll tax. So that shows democratic regime in action, and it was replaced with a council tax system, which was treated a little more well by the people. Let's look at a massacre protest in Mexico City. So, in 1968, Mexico City witnessed a student movement that culminated in I don't even know how to pronounce that, actually. It led to a massacre on October 2nd that year. The movement began as a peaceful protest against government repression and censorship. Remember, this is when Mexico was a little bit more of an authoritarian regime. They still had an active civil society, though. I mean, look at these protests. And the protests that we're talking about in question escalated into a confrontation between students and security forces. And we know that in authoritarian regimes, that can turn violent really quickly. The massacre resulted in the deaths of hundreds of protesters and also bystanders. And it sparked widespread outrage throughout the country, both domestically and internationally. While the immediate aftermath saw a crackdown on political dissent, the events of 1968 and all these deaths and arrests created a huge demand for political reform and greater respect for human rights within Mexico. Let's talk about media constraints. So all regimes of all kinds, every country in the world has some kind of restraint and law on the media. Like in the United States, in UK, and in Mexico, you can't slander other people using the media. You can't say exactly whatever you want. Yes, a lot of countries have freedom of the speech, but that doesn't mean you can go out and say whatever you want. You can't create a news article saying there's a bomb somewhere. Yes, that is freedom of speech. But there's laws against that. So every regime has restraints on the media. Authoritarian regimes, that's to a greater extent. Democracies typically have a higher degree of media freedom. So in the UK, Mexico, Nigeria, we do see some kind of government-run broadcasts. Like in the UK, we have BBC. And they have regulations that impact privately owned radio and TV stations, like in other media. Like in the UK, there's The Guardian. Mexico, look here. So we have regulatory bodies like the IFT that oversee broadcasting and aim to ensure fair competition and diverse content. In Nigeria, the NTA is the government-owned broadcaster tasked with providing public service broadcasting. In the UK, the BBC is a government-run broadcaster. It operates independently of direct government control, but is funded by a mandatory license fee, essentially a tax paid for by households. As more authoritarian regimes, all of them, China, Iran, and Russia, have more control over content of the government-owned broadcast stations. So these stations are going to support the government, their ideologies, their actions, their beliefs, way more than democratic regimes, which are going to have more diverse content, more diverse perspectives, as well as more media freedom in both the private and public sector. Broadcasts about news pertaining to the governments in China, Iran, and Russia are rarely critical of the leaders unless it portrays rival factions in the government in a negative light. In Iran, the IRIB, the Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting, is the main state-owned broadcaster. It's directly controlled by the government and operates according to principles of Islam. Independent media in Russia has faced increased pressure and censorship in recent years, as well as journalists magically dying. Journalists who dare to criticize the government risk harassment, imprisonment, violence, or magical death, magical suicide, magical jumping off hospitals. In China, we see the state-owned China Central Television, the CCTV, and that's the predominant broadcaster, and it operates under the Communist Party. It's known to adhere to party beliefs and the party line, and doesn't ever criticize the leaders or policies. We also see state-controlled media outlets like People's Daily that introduce and utilize propaganda to run official government narratives to the citizens and gain their support. And they avoid critical reporting of government leaders. They want the people to support the government, and they're not going to say anything that goes against them or paints them in a bad light. Private broadcasters in China do exist, but they have strict regulations and censorship. They have to adhere to set guidelines by the government and avoid content that's deemed politically sensitive and can disturb the peace, cause an uproar, or is critical of the CCP and their leadership. Stronger authoritarian regimes monitor and restrict citizens' media access to a greater degree than democratic regimes. So we not only see them restrict and censor the media, but also citizen access to the media and what they can look at, such as through limiting what social media platforms they can utilize. And they're trying to maintain a lot of political control. And this can be seen by the Communist Party of China using a great firewall to limit political criticism on social media. The Iranian court's suspension and removal of media licenses when a jury finds owners guilty of publishing anti-religious material or information detrimental to the national interests, which is Islamic law. We also see the Russian government nationalizing most broadcast media, which means that they're putting the media, like the one shown, in the hands of the government over private individuals. And they also have very rigid controls on opposition news segments and what they can report on and how they can criticize the government, if they do it at all. They may even come around and be like, well, on the bright side, that sort of thing. The number of journalists who have also mysteriously died in Russia is quite high. I highly encourage you to look up some of these stories. They're very interesting on how some of these Russian journalists and foreign journalists who have been to Russia have died. Let's revisit government transparency. So remember, a government is transparent when it allows information about the government, the leaders, and policymaking to circulate openly domestically and abroad. And authoritarian regimes typically have less transparency. They tend to prefer to have more secret and closed proceedings, and they say they do this to maximize order. The UK has passed the Freedom of Information Act in 2000, and this establishes public access to a wide variety of political information held by government officials that are deemed necessary or good for the public to have. It's not some national secret per se, but it's information that the government may want to know. The people may want to know. Nigeria's government also protects access to public information because they also have a Freedom of Information Act, which was passed in 2011. However, public officials often refuse to comply with the Freedom of Information Act. It's like they're holding on to everything with their hearts. Like, no, I won't give it up. And most of the time, they have very few consequences for their actions. Most of the time, it's just a slap on the wrist, even if they get caught. Sometimes it's not at all. Authoritarian regimes like China, Iran, Russia, the three that we've been talking about for so long, have no guarantees on citizens and journalists accessing information about the government or their actions or policies. So that limits their ability, for one, to know what's going on in the government, and what the authoritarian regimes want limits them to criticize their government. They don't have Freedom of Information Acts. Let's talk about competitive authoritarianism. This will be one question on your AP exam. It's not that important. Competitive authoritarian regimes act as a hybrid of democratic and authoritarian regimes. Russia is a competitive authoritarian regime. It's also known as a liberal democracy. We're just throwing another vocab word at you. They have elections, but they're contested. They're not really free and fair. They do exist, though. So that's why they're a competitive authoritarian regime. They have very limited degrees of competitiveness. We have a presence of multiple political parties, but United Russia is still the dominant one. And they also have minimal civil liberty protections as well as low government transparency. Opposition candidates have great hurdles and obstacles in not only running for elections, but registering, accessing media, particularly that's those that are state-owned, which is very prominent in Russia. They have a harder time campaigning, as well as ensuring fair treatment by electoral authorities. While opposition parties, do exist, they operate in a very restrictive environment where political dissent is marginalized, and these figures face very often harassment, imprisonment, or exile. This limits competitiveness extremely, if you haven't figured that out yet, and perpetrates the dominance of the ruling party. Let's look at some data here. So this is Freedom House scores. Basically how free are the country. And if you want a basis, you can look at the United States. It's the second row here. So we can see that countries like Iran, China, Russia have very low freedoms with the civil liberties. And countries like the United Kingdom and Mexico and Nigeria have high political rights and freedoms and liberties protected here. Your conclusions that you can draw here is that Russia and Iran, China, not free. United Kingdom, pretty free. Nigeria and Mexico, they're getting there. They're partially free. Thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. It's free, which means it costs $0, and it really does help me out. Leave a comment down below with any questions. I'll be happy to answer them. There's some links down below in the description with practice tests, key terms, guided notes, all that fun stuff. Head on over to the next AP Comparative video on some really cool political stuff.